The submitted analysis examines the 2026 geopolitical crisis, focusing heavily on Operation Epic Fury, the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran, the Minsk school bombing, and the international legal fallout surrounding President Trump's sanctions against the ICC.
The connection between the tactical military execution of Operation Epic Fury and the administration's preemptive legal obstruction of the ICC requires a tighter, more explicit synthesis in this draft.
Yeah, that structural divide was the very first thing that jumped out at me.
Right.
As I read through the text, it feels as though the author has constructed two massive parallel narrative tracks, and they're running right alongside each other, but they never actually intersect on the page.
Never. On one track, you have the sheer kinetic reality of the February 28th strikes.
Exactly.
The author gives us this highly detailed account of the staggering military casualties, the 148 deaths at the Minab's girls' school, the targeted assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the elimination of the 47 other senior officials.
It's a very visceral, intense section.
It really is. But then, and here is the weakness on the other track, often separated by dozens of pages, we get the intricate legal maneuvering.
Right. We read about the executive orders sanctioning ICC officials like Karim Khan, Kimberly Pross, Tomoko Akane.
The text lists these geopolitical events sequentially, almost like a timeline, but it completely misses the causal narrative. It misses what actually binds the military action to the legal reaction.
And that compartmentalization is a critical flaw. By treating the tactical strikes and the legal sanctions as totally separate phenomena, the draft misses a huge opportunity.
I mean, the author is trying to build a case around the widespread assertions by international legal experts that Donald Trump's actions make him the war criminal of 2026.
Yes.
But the structure of the essay just isn't supporting that thesis. It misses the chance to show how the sanctions act as a direct, preemptive shield against accountability for the specific international humanitarian law violations occurring on the ground.
Right. When you read the section detailing the 1,200 bombs dropped by the IDF and U.S. forces, it reads like a purely military after-action report.
Just ordnance types, target coordinates, casualty counts.
Exactly. And then, much later in the manuscript, when they discuss the administration threatening the ICC with sanctions, it reads like a diplomatic dispute in a boardroom in The Hague.
The reader is being forced to do all the heavy lifting.
They really are. And in the piece of analysis this dense, the author needs to be making those connections explicit.
So, if we step back and look at the intentionality behind these events, the flaw in the current structure becomes even more apparent.
Totally. Focusing solely on the military timeline in Chapter 3 and the legal timeline in Chapter 6 completely obscures the premeditated nature of this entire campaign.
Which leads perfectly to the suggestion for improvement here. The author needs to fundamentally restructure the analysis by integrating the tactical military data directly into the legal analysis.
Yes, the specific military actions shouldn't just be context. They shouldn't be background noise for a later legal debate.
They need to be framed as the exact catalyst for the escalation of ICC obstruction in February 2026.
To the legal definitions of war crimes that are actively being shielded by the administration's policies.
If the argument is that the president acted as a war criminal, the text has to show the crime and the cover-up operating in the exact same breath.
Let's talk about how the author can actually execute that on the page, because it requires a very specific kind of editorial blending.
Let's look at concrete examples.
Take the data surrounding the Minab school airstrike. The Iranian Red Crescent reported that this specific strike resulted in the deaths of over 108 children.
It's a horrifying statistic.
It is. And right now, it's buried in a list of collateral damage. To fix this, the author needs to take that specific event and link it directly to the Rome Statute Article 8 definitions of war crimes.
The author mentions the Dawn organization's 172-page communication to the ICC prosecutor later in the text, but they don't actually utilize Dawn's methodology.
Right, the Dawn referral didn't just list casualties. It paired the destruction of civilian infrastructure directly with the legal statutes prohibiting it.
The author should absolutely mirror that approach. Take a specific tactical event, like the leveling of that primary school, and juxtapose it immediately with the text of Article 8 regarding the principle of proportionality.
And the intentional targeting of civilian populations. It's about creating an undeniable timeline on the page.
Because if we want to prove that the legal obstruction was a premeditated shield, we have to look closely at the dates provided in the source material.
They tell a very specific story that the author is currently burying.
Exactly. The author notes that the executive order targeting the ICC was issued on February 6, 2026.
But Operation Epic Fury commenced on February 28th.
Right! The connection between those two dates is a massive opportunity that the author just leaves on the table. You can't drop those dates in different chapters and expect the reader to realize the implication.
The author needs to explicitly show how the timeline of the February 6th executive order aligns perfectly with the final planning phases of the February 28th strikes.
By putting those dates right next to each other in the same paragraph, it illustrates a coordinated, premeditated strategy to bypass international accountability.
Before the first bomb was even loaded onto a plane.
It's essentially like someone calling to cancel their auto insurance policy 10 minutes before they intentionally drive their car into a crowded building.
Exactly. And by pulling that February 6th executive order out of the diplomatic fallout section and placing it directly at the beginning of the military operations section, you create that immediate narrative of premeditation.
The reader suddenly understands that sanctioning Judge Kimberly Pross wasn't just some abstract reaction to past ICC warrants regarding Israel and Gaza.
Which is exactly how it was spun to the press.
Right. It was a preemptive clearing of the legal battlefield for what was about to happen in Tehran. That structural shift changes the entire momentum of the piece.
And to push that synthesis even further, another concrete example, the author needs to contrast the administration's stated goals with the tactical reality on the ground. The draft currently notes the administration's stated goal of avoiding civilian casualties.
Which we know is a standard rhetorical line in modern kinetic warfare.
But immediately after stating that, the author just lists the strikes on the Tehran Revolutionary Court, the peace building of the Red Crescent Society, and other densely populated areas.
The author needs to use these specific, high-density target locations as legal test cases within the text, not just geographical data points.
For instance, they could write something like, the administration claimed precision, yet the destruction of the Red Crescent peace building provides the exact legal test case for why the ICC's jurisdiction is being so aggressively attacked by Washington.
You have to force the military reality to answer to the legal framework.
Anticipating and systematically deconstructing the administration's own legal and moral justifications for the strikes will significantly bolster the robustness of the overarching war crimes argument.
This brings us to a really crucial structural question regarding how the author is handling opposing viewpoints.
Yeah, the weakness in this current draft is that it rightly asserts that the strikes violate the UN Charter and constitute a crime of aggression. But it essentially glosses over the specific defensive frameworks invoked by the US and Israel.
It barely mentions them. It brings up the administration's claim of an imminent nuclear threat and the breakdown of the Geneva negotiations, almost as an afterthought.
Right. It doesn't adequately explore or dismantle the invocation of Article 51 of the UN Charter regarding self-defense.
Nor does it adequately address the administration's reliance on the 1989 Bear Doctrine.
By completely ignoring these counter-arguments, the analysis leaves itself highly vulnerable to accusations of being one-sided, or even legally naive.
It's a classic trap in geopolitical analysis, especially when the writer is morally outraged by the subject matter.
The author is clearly so convinced of the illegality of the strikes, and understandably so, given the civilian toll, that they don't bother to seriously entertain the administration's legal architecture.
But the administration isn't operating in a rhetorical vacuum. They constructed a deliberate, albeit controversial, legal and moral framework to justify Operation Epic Fury under the banner of peace through strength.
If the author wants to prove that the president is the war criminal of 2026, they have to prove that his legal defenses are hollow.
And a massive weakness here is ignoring the moral argument regarding Iran's massacre of 32,000 to 43,000 of its own protesting citizens in January 2026.
The administration actively weaponized this domestic slaughter to justify international intervention, and the draft barely touches on how effective that rhetorical shield actually is.
So the suggestion here is to dedicate a specific, robust section of the essay entirely to steel manning the administration's arguments and its domestic legal justifications.
You have to build up the opponent's argument to its absolute strongest, most persuasive point before you tear it down.
Once you have steel-manned claims like the imminent nuclear threat under Article 51 and the moral imperative to stop a domestic massacre, you then systematically dismantle those claims using the provided diplomatic and legal evidence.
It shows the reader that you aren't just ignoring the opposing view. You've examined it, weighed it, and found it fundamentally legally flawed.
Let's walk through concrete examples of exactly how the author can execute this steel manning and dismantling process.
Starting with the imminent nuclear threat narrative.
The administration heavily invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter, claiming self-defense against a regime that was supposedly days away from acquiring a usable nuclear weapon.
To dismantle this effectively, the author must incorporate the reports from the Omani mediator, Badr Abu Saidi,
which are currently buried in a footnote.
Right. On February 27th, literally the day before Operation Epic Fury commenced, Abu Saidi stated on the record that a deal regarding Iran's nuclear material stockpile was within reach.
The author should pull this exact diplomatic timeline out of the footnotes and use it to directly counter the U.S. claim of an imminent nuclear threat.
That Omani mediation timeline completely fractures the imminent threat excuse.
The author needs to highlight the severe contrast here.
On one hand, you have the State of the Union address, painting Iran as being on the absolute precipice of a nuclear breakout.
Justifying a massive preemptive strike.
Exactly. And on the other hand, you have the actual, boots-on-the-ground mediators in Geneva saying an agreement on the stockpile is essentially done.
By placing the Omani mediators' February 27th quotes directly against the February 28th launch of the bombers, the author effectively shatters the Article 51 self-defense justification.
And they do it without having to rely on heavy-handed editorializing. The timeline itself does the dismantling.
The author just has to set up the juxtaposition. The timeline is the weapon.
It removes the author's bias from the equation entirely.
Now that brings up the other major shield the administration is hiding behind, which is perhaps the most delicate part of the entire analysis, the moral argument.
The administration heavily utilized the Iranian regime's horrific domestic human rights abuses as a moral justification for military intervention.
Specifically, the crushing of the 2025 to 2026 citizen uprising, which resulted in upwards of 43,000 deaths.
The president literally went on television and told the Iranian people that help is on the way.
The author has a real tightrope to walk here. They cannot ignore this massacre. To ignore the reality of what the regime did to its own people makes the author look like an apologist for a brutal dictatorship.
It's a very difficult needle to thread. How do you acknowledge this horrific domestic reality without conceding the administration's legal argument for intervention?
The way to do it is to analyze how the U.S. weaponized this moral outrage to bypass strict international law requirements for self-defense.
The author needs to write a section that clearly states, yes, the Iranian regime committed unspeakable atrocities against its own people in January 2026.
However, international law, specifically the UN Charter, does not permit unilateral military intervention and regime change under the guise of human rights,
especially without explicit UN Security Council authorization.
The author must surgically separate the moral revulsion of the regime's actions from the legal parameters of international warfare.
You validate the trauma of the Iranian people, but you refuse to let that trauma be used as a blank check for unilateral military aggression by a foreign superpower.
You dismantle the administration's argument by showing that international humanitarian law exists precisely to prevent unilateral actors from playing global police based on their own, often shifting moral calculus.
Which brings us to another concrete example of what needs deconstructing: the domestic legal architecture the administration is using, the 1989 Barr Memo.
The Barr Doctrine. The current draft mentions it in passing, almost like a piece of historical trivia.
But this is the absolute core of the administration's domestic legal cover.
The author is focusing so heavily on the international law perspective that they are completely overlooking how the administration is legally justifying this to the American public and the domestic courts.
As a quick refresher, the Barr Memo originated during the H.W. Bush administration right before the Panama invasion.
It essentially argued that the FBI could apprehend fugitives in foreign countries without the host country's consent.
And, broadly, that the president can order actions that violate international law and that American domestic courts cannot intervene.
The author needs to explain how the administration has revived and expanded this specific domestic legal framework to justify operations like Epic Fury.
They have to contrast this domestic legal cover with international legal realities. It's not enough to just say the strikes were illegal.
The author should write a detailed paragraph breaking down how the administration relies on the Barr Doctrine to essentially tell the international community it doesn't matter if the ICC or the UN Security Council thinks this is illegal.
Constitutional authority to unilaterally snatch foreign leaders or launch preemptive strikes.
By explicitly breaking down the mechanics of the Barr Doctrine, the author shows the reader exactly how the administration is legally insulating itself.
You weren't just pointing out that they broke the law. You were exposing the specific legal loophole they dug to crawl under it.
Expanding the scope to evaluate how the coordinated assault on the ICC fundamentally alters the post-1945 rules-based global order will elevate the overarching impact and urgency of the piece.
This is where we transition from discussing a regional conflict to evaluating a profound systemic shift in global affairs.
The weakness in the latter half of the draft is one of scale and consequence.
The text does a very thorough job documenting the personal and immediate impacts of the ICC sanctions.
It details the canceled credit cards of Judge Kimberly Prost,
The specific travel bans targeting prosecutor Kareem Khan.
and the sheer volume of the Dawn organization's 172-page communication.
That granular detail is great, but it severely underexplores the systemic global ripple effects of these actions.
It notes that the U.S. is punishing the court, that it doesn't fully capture the so what factor.
The so what is arguably the most important element of any geopolitical analysis.
Right now, the draft reads as a somewhat localized, albeit intense, dispute between the White House and The Hague.
But what actually happens when the world's sole superpower actively and aggressively dismantles international judicial bodies?
It empowers every other state actor to act with absolute impunity.
It plunges the world into an era of what one expert quoted in the text accurately called international law nihilism.
The major weakness here is that the draft stops its analysis at the borders of the immediate Iranian conflict. It doesn't look over the horizon to see what this precedent means for the rest of the 21st century.
So the suggestion is we need to push the author to broaden the concluding analysis to examine the geopolitical realignment caused by these specific actions.
The administration has floated this idea of a board of peace alternative to the UN and the ICC. The author needs to focus on how this aggressive impunity agenda sets a terrifying precedent for other global conflicts.
We have to explore how this effectively greenlights expansionism by other world powers.
Think about it. If the U.S. can blatantly bypass the UN Security Council, sanction the prosecutors of the ICC, and launch preemptive strikes to achieve regime change in Iran under a flimsy Article 51 justification,
What stops Russia, China, or any other regional power from citing this exact precedent for their own territorial ambitions?
exactly, in Eastern Europe or the South China Sea?
To give a concrete example of how to illustrate the collapse of these universal standards, the author has a perfect, striking dichotomy right in the source material that they are currently underutilizing.
The contrasting treatment of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro and Russia's Vladimir Putin.
The author needs to put these two events side by side to show the absolute hypocrisy of the new global order.
On one hand, you have Maduro, who was seized in a raid justified by that very same Barr Doctrine we discussed earlier.
He was treated purely as a criminal target, snatched up because it was politically expedient.
On the other hand, you have Vladimir Putin, who was hosted by the president in Alaska for a summit,
Complete with a red carpet and a stealth bomber flyover.
despite having highly publicized active ICC arrest warrants against him.
That contrast is absolutely staggering, and it perfectly encapsulates the concept of international law nihilism.
The author can use the Maduro versus Putin example to highlight the selective, transactional enforcement of international law.
Imagine a paragraph that argues, the administration's approach to international justice is entirely transactional. The Barr Doctrine is deployed to snatch Maduro when it serves domestic political interests, while active ICC warrants are flagrantly ignored to host Putin when diplomatically desired.
This proves the thesis beautifully. It shows the reader that international law is no longer functioning as a universal standard of human rights.
It's merely a tool of statecraft to be weaponized against enemies and discarded for friends.
It's a very dark realization, but it's the logical conclusion of the administration's policies.
As another concrete example, the author can also explicitly tie the U.S. actions against the ICC to broader warnings from the international community.
The draft briefly mentions Germany, but it needs to highlight the specific warnings from the German foreign minister,
who explicitly noted that crippling the ICC serves the interests of other expansionist powers.
They stated it would be one of Putin's greatest joys to see The Hague dismantled by the Americans.
The author needs to take these diplomatic quotes and build a robust section explaining how the veto power in the UN Security Council, combined with the neutering of the ICC, leaves absolutely no mechanism left to hold powerful actors accountable.
And if we look at the administration's ultimate goal regarding the ICC, it gets even more concerning.
The text notes that the administration isn't just ignoring the court, they are allegedly pushing the ICC to amend the Rome Statute to carve out permanent codified exceptions for U.S. officials.
This is a breathtaking detail that is currently buried in the text. It needs to be front and center in the conclusion.
The author needs to explore the long-term implications of this specific demand. They should discuss how this rogue state behavior, as it's characterized by human rights groups in the text, permanently fractures the very concept of universal human rights.
The author needs to pose a fundamental question to the reader. In the conclusion, if the Rome Statute is formally amended to exempt the United States from prosecution for war crimes, does international law even exist anymore?
The author can forcefully argue that demanding a permanent carve-out is infinitely worse than simply ignoring the court.
Ignoring the court is a violation. Amending the court's founding document to legalize your own impunity is the destruction of the institution itself.
It establishes a formalized, tiered system of global justice where superpowers possess written immunity while smaller nations are subject to the law.
That is the ultimate so what of this entire geopolitical crisis. It's not just about 2026. It's about the next century of global conflict.
That perspective really changes how we view the tactical events at the beginning of the essay.
The author must weave these systemic implications back to the human cost.
The conclusion should circle back and state that the tragedy of the MENAB Girls' School is not just a localized horror of Operation Epic Fury.
It is a preview of the new global standard.
If the architects of that specific strike successfully force the ICC to grant them permanent immunity, then the deaths of those 148 children represent the final burial of the post-1945 rules-based order.
They aren't just casualties of war. They are the casualties of a collapsing system of global justice.
The narrative arc of the entire piece comes together with that realization. You start with the visceral, tactical reality of the bombs dropping on Tehran.
You move methodically through the administration's hollow legal justifications and domestic loopholes.
And you end with the systemic collapse of global accountability. The author has all the raw data needed to tell this incredible story.
They have the quotes from the Omani mediators, the timelines of the executive orders, the tragic casualty figures, and the legal statutes.
They just need to arrange them so that the reader understands that 2026 wasn't just a year of intense conflict in the Middle East. It was the year the architecture of international justice was fundamentally and intentionally dismantled.
Cementing the narrative of the war criminal of 2026.
The piece has immense potential. It really does. It just needs this broader perspective to truly resonate with a sophisticated audience.
Let's briefly recap the main points we've discussed today. First, we focused on completeness and focus, explicitly stating that the author must link the tactical realities of Operation Epic Fury directly to the preemptive ICC Sanctions timeline,
rather than treating them as separate parallel tracks.
Second, we addressed angle and originality, advising the author to dedicate a specific section to steel manning and then systematically dismantling the administration's legal justifications.
Like the Article 51 imminent threat claim, the moral shield of the domestic uprisings, and the 1989 Barr Doctrine.
Finally, we looked at significance and relevance, encouraging the author to broaden the concluding analysis to capture the global collapse of the rules-based order.
And to summarize the actionable suggestions you can implement right away during your rewrite, integrate the MENAB School casualty data directly into the legal definitions of Rome Statute Article 8, war crimes.
Use the timeline of the Omani mediation to counter and shatter the imminent nuclear threat narrative.
And finally, use the striking dichotomy between the treatment of Venezuela's Maduro and Russia's Putin to vividly illustrate the selective enforcement of global justice.
We warmly invite you to revise your geopolitical analysis using these lenses and submit the updated draft back to us for another critique.